This is a hypothesis test about a population proportion example. A survey of 400 Twitter users found that 220 felt the site should do more to decrease hateful and abusive content on the site. First question, does this sample give us evidence that a majority of all Twitter users feel this way? And a second question, construct a 95% confidence interval for the proportion of Twitter users who feel this way. How does your confidence interval support your hypothesis test conclusion? So in hypothesis testing, the first step is to write your null and alternative hypothesis. Now in this question, we're asked if the majority of all Twitter users feel this way, and the definition of majority is more than 50%. Since that's a greater than sign, that's in our alternative hypothesis. Our null hypothesis always has an equal sign, and so our null hypothesis is that the population proportion is the same as 50%. The second thing we need to do in hypothesis testing is show that we can apply the central limit theorem. We have to show that n times p and n times 1 minus p are both greater than or equal to 10. So in this problem, 400 Twitter users were surveyed. So 400 times 0.50, and 1 minus, or that would also be 0.50. But both of these, we know, are greater than or equal to 10. And so the central limit theorem is satisfied. The next thing we do is we need to produce a test statistic and a p-value. So our test statistic and p-value we're going to compute by using StatCrunch. In our data in the problem, we had 220 people say yes, they felt this way, out of a sample of 400. And so we're going to go to StatCrunch. Under our stat menu, we're going to look for proportion stats because we're working with proportions. And we only have one group here, so we're going to be talking about one population. And we have a summary. We don't have the individual results, but we do have a summary that 220 out of 400 felt this way. So let's go to StatCrunch and enter that information. Okay, so again to stat, and we're working with proportions. We have one sample, and we have a summary. So the number of successes, 220 people said they felt this way out of a total number of 400. We're doing a hypothesis test. Our number in our hypothesis, null hypothesis, is 0.50, and the sign in our alternative is a greater than sign because we're interested in a majority. And so now we'll compute the test statistic and a p-value. So we have a test statistic of 2 and a p-value of 0.02. So let's record that and finish our work in the hypothesis test. So again, we had our null and alternative hypothesis. So here was our null hypothesis. Here was our alternative hypothesis. We checked that the central limit theorem worked, that n times p and n times 1 minus p, that these were both greater than 10, so we kept on going. Our test statistic, we have a test statistic of 2 and a p-value of 0.02. Now, our p-value tells us that this is highly unlikely to have happened. So our p-value tells us that we are less than our significance level, and the traditional significance level is 0.05. So anytime we're less than that, like 0.02, which is less than 0.05, that tells us that our sample is highly unusual if the null hypothesis was true. And so we don't believe the null hypothesis is true. We're going to reject our null hypothesis. And so now let's write a conclusion. If we reject our null hypothesis, we believe that this is true. And so that says that the majority, in other words, more than 50% of Twitter users feel this way. And it's important to remember that this conclusion is about all Twitter users, not just the 400 that were sampled. We already know that the 400 that were sampled felt this way, but this tells us a conclusion about everyone who uses Twitter, that this sample is so unusual that it tells us that the alternative hypothesis is what we believe is true. Now let's talk about the confidence interval. So for the confidence interval, we're going to go back to StatCrunch, and we're simply going to check the box that says confidence interval instead of hypothesis test. Okay, so if we go back to StatCrunch, and here we have the option to edit our work so we don't have to enter the data all over. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to say this time, instead of a hypothesis test, let's use the data to construct a confidence interval. So all I did was click the confidence interval tab, and we'll compute. And so we get a lower limit of 0.501 and an upper limit of 0.599. So let's go ahead and record that and talk about what that means. So our confidence interval, the lower limit is 0.501 and the upper limit is 0.599. And the question was, how does this support your conclusion in the hypothesis test? So our conclusion was that the majority felt this way. Notice that these values are all greater than 50%. And what does greater than 50% mean? A majority. And so this confidence interval supports the conclusion because it only includes values which are greater than 50%.